Welcome to episode 12 of Kontrarian Korner. I'm Ben Kelleran. Today we have Anas Alhajji on as a guest. He's an expert on all things oil, and he's going to be helping us walk through some of the stuff about the petrodollar, some of the headlines you see there, but also taking a look at the big picture for energy, oil, and anything else to kind of keep an eye on as an investor in the energy space. So Anas, thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so over the last, call it 2 weeks to a month, I've probably listened to 5 or 10 different podcasts, and they've all been talking about the end of the petrodollar and the sky is falling, and it's good for clicks, but there's maybe not a whole bunch of substance there. So if you could walk us through what you've been talking about a little bit on your own Twitter and your own feed as far as the petrodollar, that'd be awesome.
Sure. Last April, a video appeared on YouTube. A guy, most likely he's a gold trader slash crypto trader with a large number of followers on YouTube. He talked about the end of the petrodollar. I was familiar with the video. I ignored it because it was a complete nonsense. But the video went viral. Other YouTubers, especially those who are involved in gold and cryptocurrency, they saw how viral it went, so everyone wants to jump on the wagon. So we ended up with several videos, and most of them with large followers. Then this fever basically migrated to Twitter. So large tweeters, those big accounts with 400,000 plus, they don't want to be left out, so they grabbed the idea and they started talking about it. And it carried from there. It's a life on its own. A lot of people, especially people who are young, they never heard the term petrodollar before. And all of a sudden, like you said, they felt based on those videos that the sky is falling. So they went to Google, they start searching for petrodollar, and the search on Google went through the roof, literally. It's like for about a couple of weeks, it was one of the top searches on Google. The issue is this, and just for a background, when I did my PhD dissertation, part of it was related to these things. So in a sense, I am familiar with all those agreements, with all these things that have been done, etc. So I'm not a newcomer to this based on what we've seen on YouTube and others. I've been there for a long time. There is no agreement. And it does not make sense to have an agreement. That's the end of the story. That's the short story of this. And they said that on June 9th, 1974, there was an agreement between Saudi Arabia and the United States to price oil in dollar. And that's a 50-year deal. First of all, again, there was no agreement, and all the agreements with Saudi Arabia on everything, including whether you want to talk about education, you want to talk about training, you want to talk about military equipment, etc. There is no $50 deal, a 50-year deal at all. The Saudis never signed a deal with the United States that is 50 years, never, on anything. So in a sense, you can see where the lie is. There was no agreement on one side, and there are no agreements on 50 years at all. On June 6, 1974, Crown Prince Fahd, who became a king later on, came into the United States with a big Saudi delegation. And they meant business. This was significant because in March, just 3 months earlier, the Saudis ended the oil embargo on the United States, officially ended the oil embargo on the United States. So the United States basically really wanted to mend relations after the embargo. And the Saudis have certain demands. So they did sign agreements on the 9th of June, but none of them related to pricing oil in dollar. The agreements were economic cooperation. Of course, Saudi Arabia at that time had a very primitive economy. They want to send their students to the United States. They want to train their people. They want to build an army. They want modern weapons. They wanted almost everything. So those who were posting those videos and those tweets, they attached them to pictures of supposedly agreement. That agreement basically, and you cannot even make the words, you cannot even make the writing, just people were convinced that that's a copy of the agreement. Well, that's not really the agreement. Those are the meeting minutes at the White House. At the meeting minutes basically said, you know, I like you, I really, you know, you are doing a great job, and I like your country, and I like to cooperate with you. And just like every group is praising the other. And that's it. So what they claim to be a copy of the agreement basically is a copy of the meeting minutes. And that's it. And then they have a copy of a whole page of New York Times with a small story that you cannot even make up the words, but you can make up the title that says historic agreement with Saudi Arabia. And those basically who claim this petrodollar, they are making up the story, supposedly showing people the copy of the agreement and showing the headline from the New York Times, a historic agreement, and therefore it's a petrodollar. Well, the historic agreement basically was to buy weapons and get training, military training from the United States. In the meeting on the 6th and whatever followed, they formed 6 committees. And those 6 committees basically are 6 programs, and they signed agreement on those programs. So there are some economics, some related to health. Remember, Saudi Arabia was a very primitive economy, so they need everything. So they signed those agreements, but they have nothing to do with pricing oil in dollar.
Yeah,
now,
it's interesting because you have the short attention span and the fast-moving news cycle where people get caught up in that, and then it's basically on to the next thing.
So here are the issues that really kind of debunk the whole story. Aramco, now it's Saudi Aramco, but Aramco, it's Arab American Oil Company. That's what the name of it. That's what Aramco is, Arab American. Aramco was an American company, and literally now it is Exxon and Chevron. So in 1974, the Saudis have no control of the company. It was an American company. It was an American company that sell that oil that owned by Americans and get dollars for it. So the Saudis do not even get dollars for their oil. They get the taxes from the companies and they get the royalties, but they don't get the revenues. So to go as an American to ask them to accept dollars for all revenues and you are getting all the money does not make any sense. So that's number one. Number two, the Saudi Riyal is pegged to the dollar. So if you think about MBS right now, why he has to shoot himself in the foot by trying to hurt the dollar and consequently hurting his currency? That does not make sense. The third point is, if you go back to 1974, the guy who is really of interest is the Shah of Iran. He had the largest population in the Middle East. He had the largest military. He had the largest secret service. He is the American policeman in the area. Why the White House did not go to the Shah of Iran and tell him to accept dollars for oil and go to the Saudis with a population that only fraction of Iranian population and fraction of the Iranian economy? Does not make sense. They should have gone to the Shah, not to the Saudis. So it does not make sense. The fourth point, which is another important point, is that when the dollar was floated in the early 70s and oil was priced in dollar, simply because it's the American companies that are selling it. So oil was priced in dollar anyway. So the real value of exported barrels went down. And those governments get a portion of the sales. So if the value goes down, their portion goes down with it. So they wanted to find another way. So they started looking at getting rid of the dollar seriously. So if you go back to that era, you will find ministers and officials talking about getting rid of the dollar. That's absolutely correct. There are many statements regarding this. But after 2 years of research, and they commissioned private consultancies, they commissioned the World Bank, they commissioned the IMF, etc. I mean, all kind of groups trying to study how to maintain the value of oil exports. And the end result was there is no substitute to the dollar. Why? Because what are the substitutes? You want to use the sterling? You want to use the Dutch mark? You want to use the Japanese yen at that time? Of course, the UN, no one spoke of China at that time. So they found out that whatever problems you have with the dollar, you have it with other single currencies. So pricing oil in single currency have the same problems anyway. So switching from the dollar does not make any sense. But at the same time, they looked at basket of currencies because they said, well, probably basket of currency is good. Well, it did not work out. And the reason why it did not work out, because with basket of currencies, the dollar basically had the lion's share because the dollar dominates international trade. So if the dollar is the dominant, you did not benefit from the basket. But the basket has a serious problem because OPEC members are scattered around the world. And we have Indonesia, 40% of Indonesia's trade with Japan, while we have Venezuela on the other side with 50% of its trade with the United States. So the basket will benefit one country, it's going to hurt the other. So they are not going to agree on it. And then they have to change it every month. And that's chaos. And it's costly. So the basket did not make any sense. So we are still with the dollar. They looked at gold, they found out there is no liquidity in gold. So it did not make any sense. They looked at the IMF SDR, the special drawing rights, and they were leaning toward the SDR. But they found out the SDR is an imaginary measure. And when you get cash, you are going to get the dollar anyway. So it did not make any sense. So naturally, after 2 years of research, they have to stick to the dollar. And the White House and the Americans knew there is no substitute for the dollar. What is good about the dollar that does not exist in other currencies? You need 3 characteristics in any currency to price oil in it. You want massive liquidity because oil trade is the largest trade in the world. You need the total value, of course, the total does not mean anything here, is about 1.6 trillion. Of course, you don't need 1.6 trillion of dollars because the dollar exchange hands over the year, so you don't need that much, but still, it's the largest trade on earth. So the Dutch mark is not going to do it. The Japanese yen is not going to do it. The sterling is not going to do it. We have only the dollar. And on the other hand, if you look at it has to be acceptable worldwide. And there is nothing like the dollar these days. I mean, you go to every single mafia in the world, or the smugglers around the world, wherever they are. You put all types of currency in front of them, they'll grab the dollar. Only in some areas close to Europe, basically, they will grab the euro just because of the geographic location. But otherwise, wherever you go, they will take the dollar. They will take the dollar over anything else. In fact, until today, we have economies that are dollarizing on their own without a government policy. You go to Turkey, for example. You go to Egypt. You go to Sudan. If things are just in dollars. So there is no substitute for the dollar. You need a currency that has the liquidity, a currency that is relatively stable, and it's acceptable worldwide. There is no other currency beside that. Oil is priced in dollar. It will continue to be priced in dollar. The United States of America is the largest oil producer in the world. The United States of America is one of the largest exporters of oil in the world. And as you know, one of the major markets is in New York. So as long as the United States have this dominant position in the oil market, no one else can do anything to pricing. The final point here is we have to distinguish between pricing oil in dollar and getting revenues in non-dollar. These are two different things. Even in Shanghai exchange today, the Shanghai exchange is based on the Chinese yuan, which means that oil in the Shanghai exchange is literally exchanged for or sold for yuan. And if you dig deeper into the data, you find out that the price in Shanghai Exchange in yuan is a mirror image to the Dubai Exchange in dollar. So no matter what, oil is priced in dollar. Now, countries are free to get any other currency they want. And we've seen it. Russia is getting other currencies. Iran is getting other currencies. Venezuela is getting other currencies. But notice that all those embargoed countries that are trying to get other currencies simply because if there is no trade with the United States, why do they need the dollar? So the whole, when people think, especially those in the crypto world, they think the collapse of the petrodollar, and just let me back up here a little bit. What is the petrodollar? The petrodollar basically is when oil prices went up in the 70s, those governments in the oil producing countries gained a lot of money and their economies were primitive. They did not know what to do with the money. So they have to recycle this in Europe and the United States. That's what the petrodollar is. And those in the crypto world, they think, well, if we get rid of the dollar, then it's good for crypto and it's good for gold and this and this. This is a complete nonsense. And whatever I'm going to say right now, this could be a surprise to many people. The substitute for petrodollar is not other currencies. The substitute is not gold. The substitute is not crypto. The substitute is oil in the ground. Why I'm saying this? Because when Prince Fahd came into the White House on June 6, 1974, what was the big issue for the United States? And of course, we have Nixon and then Ford administrations. The big issue was the following. The Saudis gained a lot of money, and they found out that inflation is eating up their money. The dollar is going down. The real interest rate was zero. And there is some asset confiscation in Europe and the United States. So why I have to sell above my need only to accumulate dollars to lose their value and lose them all in the future? So what they did, they cut production. They said, all I'm going to do is produce as much as I need to buy, and that's it. But when they cut production, that's a crisis because that means the United States and Europe is not going to get the oil and oil prices will go higher. So what the United States proposed was, look, what you are worried about. You need real return and you need assurances that your assets will not be confiscated. So here is a proposal. You invest in our treasuries. We guarantee that you will get high return and a real return on assets. And by law, we will guarantee that your assets will not be confiscated. So if there is a deal, call it a secret deal or not, it's not really secret, but let's call it even a secret deal like some people. The deal was not about pricing oil in dollar. It's about convincing the Saudis not to keep oil in the ground. And this extra money will be recycled, that the petrodollars will be recycled in the United States, guaranteeing those two things, real return on assets and no confiscation. And that's what the Saudis did. They increased production and they brought in the petrodollars to invest in treasuries. Now we can see the link with oil pricing in this case, because if everything is going to be in dollar, you just guaranteed that the dollar will stay there. And the reason why, because other countries did not provide the same security to the assets like the United States. I mean, look at what Europe is doing, the EU right now. They want to confiscate $300 billion of Russian assets, which is a crisis if they do that. Crisis for everyone in the world, because what you are doing is there will be no trust, and no one, even rich people and others, they will not trust anyone else after that. They prefer to have cash and other things, etc., not to encounter the same problem. So briefly, that's the story of the petrodollar and all the issues. It's a fake story. It's meaningless, has no ground at all, and never existed.
Yeah, I think that's a really good breakdown. Thanks for kind of walking through all those different steps. You had mentioned the Saudi Riyal being pegged to the dollar, and this might be a little bit of a detour, but I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on the potential for the Saudis to depeg from the US dollar at some point in the future.
Yes, it will happen under certain conditions. And the Saudis, let me put it this way so people will understand this. If you want to look at the number of PhDs in all fields relative to the population, Saudi Arabia is one of the highest, if not the highest in the world. Okay. So what they did is in the last 40 years, they've been sending their students to the United States and to Europe and Australia and other places, literally to get that level of education. So we are talking about a very sophisticated group of people. We are not so talking about Saudi Arabia 50 years ago. The debeg is going to happen only if the economy is diversified enough. As long as it is still dependent on oil, that there is no way they can debeg the real from the dollar. Because if you go back to 2020, remember when prices went to the negative? Okay, just imagine what would have happened to the Saudi Riyal at that time if it wasn't pegged to the dollar. Just a total collapse. So they need the peg until the economy is diversified. Can they do that by 2030? No, they still need more time. And the reason why they need more time, although they are trying to diversify, their objective is to have oil as only 30% of their GDP or government revenue, sorry, 30% of government revenues. But the fact is, if you dig deeper, there are accounting issues and people need to pay attention to these accounting issues and they are aware of them. For example, all the petrochemical plants, which is Saudi Arabia has one of the largest petrochemical industries in the world, are classified as industries, not oil sector. Oil sector is extractive. Petrochemicals are industries. So if you look at a pie chart with the division of the economy, you see the oil sector basically is this much, let's say, for example, 40%. But in reality, petrochemicals are counted on this side as industry, but it should be added to the oil because it depends on the oil sector.
It's just a derivative, yeah.
Correct. So they need time basically to rebalance the economy and diversify. And therefore, I don't think we will see it, at least in my lifetime.
Okay, but 2 decades, 3 decades, somewhere further?
Well, we got to see where that diversification is going to go. Here is the problem with diversification, and I don't want to be too academic about it. The problem with diversification is, and this is funny because you see it all over the world. We've seen it in the last 30 years. You see a president or a king coming in and say, I want to diversify, and he works so hard for 5 years on diversifying the economy. And they reduce the role of oil, let's say, from 60% to 40%, which is a tremendous success. And then oil prices go from 40 to 120. And all that diversification, basically, because we are looking at accounting, right? We are looking at numbers. All that diversification is gone because higher prices made the share of oil in the budget and the finances way, way higher. And all of a sudden, they are worse than before, although they have more money. So the issue is we need to see the real diversification, not related to prices. A real diversification basically takes time. Remember that what we see in the United States today and Europe is the result of 400 years of development.
Yeah.
So we don't expect the Saudis basically and others to catch up with 400 years only with 50 or to 70 years.
Yeah, it wouldn't happen overnight, but it's interesting to see how fast some countries in the Middle East are growing and changing. To kind of shift my focus to some of the data around the energy sector and oil, one of the things that's been frustrating is trying to make heads or tails of some of the energy data from supply, demand, all that stuff. And I was hoping you could walk us through some of the issues you see there with EIA, IEA forecasts, maybe some of the misleading media coverage and headlines, and anything else you think would be interesting to talk about.
I am going to apologize for those who heard me before because I'm repeating the same thing on almost every media interview and every podcast, because everyone is asking the same important questions, and I'm talking about the same important issues. So I apologize for repeating whatever I said before. The problem we have is that in the oil market in particular, we have a serious problem with data. Data deteriorated significantly since 2017, literally with the share revolution and the increase of the liquids from shale. That really deteriorated the data significantly since 2017. And the EIA couldn't solve the problem. For those who are familiar with or follow me on Twitter and follow my colleagues on Twitter, they heard about the EIA adjustment. And what happened with the adjustment is, in the equations, you have supply on one side and the demand on one side, and they don't equal each other, but they have to equal each other. So what they do is they add this adjustment to one part of the equation to make it equal. The problem is this adjustment number start getting larger and larger, which means that there is a serious problem with the equation. And people start complaining, etc. The EIA tried to fix this problem, and it seems they were not able to get a handle of it until today. They were partially able to do some accounting tricks to lower it, but still a big problem. That's a sign of that data deterioration that I was talking about. Then COVID came in. We have a serious problem with COVID because the data deteriorated significantly from several fronts. One of them basically is because people who maintain the data in many countries are no longer in the office anymore, and they were not able to maintain the data. So we have issues there. Then we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have the largest oil-producing country in the world, which is Russia, before the United States became the largest oil-producing country, all of a sudden being sanctioned, and we have what we call the ghost ships or the ghost tankers. And that's created another problem for the data. Move forward to 2024, all of a sudden we have many elections. We already have seen, as you know, elections in France, we've seen elections in the UK, and before that we've seen elections in India, and now we have elections in the United States. The two most important elections that influence the data and the reporting basically are the United States and India. And something happened this year that we never seen before. We know that campaigns invest in the media. They literally pay for advertising in the media, especially on TV. And this is an old trick. We know about it long ago. This year, we've seen something different. We have major news agencies, without mentioning names, especially when it comes to oil stories. The oil stories basically are either false or tilted or kind of reorganized in a way to serve a certain purpose. If you collect all those stories since the beginning of 2024 until today, all those stories that are being false or tilted were designed to praise Biden in the United States or Modi in India. In fact, if you look at India's numbers and various reporting on India, you can see, in our reports basically on Substack, we mentioned this early in the year, said, look, be careful with the Indian data because there is something does not make sense. And they were talking about this boom in India and how India is going to, the largest growth in oil demand is going to be in India and focus on India, et cetera, et cetera. And we are looking at the actual numbers and shipping numbers and all this stuff, and it does not add up. And in fact, even today, and this is kind of something very strange, if you take the average of the first 6 months of the year, the average imports, oil imports of India in the first 6 months of the year, they are virtually the same like the first 6 months of 2023. So where is the growth? India's oil production did not change. So where is the growth? So we can see where the exaggeration, because it's an election year, we see the exaggeration there. The same thing with Biden. For example, most of the stories about the success of the price cap and the sanctions on Russian oil, these are mostly false stories or they took kind of a headline news and they tilted the story. And we collected all of those. So in our daily energy report, basically, we focus on those. We show the data, we show the real data, and we show how false it is, or how they literally reworded the story to make it look like a success for the policy while it is not. So we have data deterioration since 2017, and now we have problem with reporting. Everything I said, this is just the introduction to answer your question. Now comes in OPEC and the IEA. The IEA, the International Energy Agency. We are in July. Historically speaking, if you go back decades and you look at the forecast, it was very normal that in December, you will get all kinds of forecasts, and they are wild. But as you move month after month into the year, you will see that they start converging. And by the end of the year, most of the numbers are the same or close to each other. So that's the history. But for the last 3 years after COVID, we have a completely different story. Even if you look at data for 2023. So we are talking about last year. The IEA is on this side and OPEC on this side. What's wrong? Not only that, basically, we have a serious problem because, like, even today, if you take the Chinese demand numbers for last year, they are half of what OPEC is still reporting today. So if you want data about China, do you believe the government of China or do you believe OPEC? Especially that the Chinese numbers are lower. It's not like the idea that they are trying to exaggerate the numbers. So we do have serious problem with the data. So for 2024, the International Energy Agency expects oil demand, global oil demand, to grow by less than 1 million barrels a day. OPEC think is 2.2. This is about the year, so we're still going. But even if you go back to the first quarter, which is gone, that's the past. The data should converge and we should have the same data or close to each other. OPEC think that demand grew by 2.3 million barrels a day in the first quarter. The IEA think it's only 800. We are not talking about 60,000, 70,000 barrels difference. We are talking about 1.4 million barrels difference. It's huge. So you take the data deterioration on one side, you take the bad reporting from the media, you take this divergence in forecast that is wild and wide and we never seen it before, anyone should be confused. Now, I can say that this is good for someone like me. It's good for my subscribers. It's good for my clients because I can go in literally and distill all this and get it right. But at the same time, it is sad because we reach a point where I'm making money out of correcting lies or correcting mistakes, and that's not right.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting to see some of the discrepancies in the statistics, and it might be politically motivated, but do you think that's something that gets fixed after this election cycle, or you think it's
Let me explain this idea of politically motivated, because this is a very important point. It could be politically motivated, but let's take politics out of it completely. The data is politicized even before it comes to the IEA and before it comes to OPEC. Why? Because if you look at the IEA, it has large number of very brilliant people, most of them with masters and PhDs. They are truly good analysts. And now what they do is they want to receive all the data from other countries who are members of the IEA, and they want to receive their plans and what are the regulations and the policies on the books so they can make the forecast. Because their forecast is based on what? Based on the data they get, and then they have to forecast out of this data based on the policies that are on the books, based on the regulations and the laws. So a country like Germany basically will submit all of that to them. Well, as you know, Germany wants to be the queen of green. and they have strange laws and strange plans, etc. Many of it failed. But they submit all of that to the IEA. And the guy at the IEA received them, and now he has to do the forecast within the data he's been given and all those plans that are on the books, and they become laws. But those who made the laws and the policies are politicians. So the data and the plans are already embedded in it. So the data and the outlook is politicized even before it entered the computers of the IEA. So even if you eliminate the politics out of the end of it, it's coming with the data to the IEA and OPEC and others. In fact, OPEC, I don't know who the smart guy who did this, but this is genius. A guy at OPEC, and I don't know what the development of it, I need to ask about it, how this came about, did not believe what the numbers, they did not believe what the members are providing, because they wanted to know every month what the members are producing and exporting. And long ago, they realized there is something wrong. Why a country, okay, it went through political turmoil and it has all those natural disasters, etc., but their production is always 1.6, 1.6, 1.6 for years. And they have fires and explosions and technical problems, and production is always 1.6. So what they did is they said, you know what the heck, I'm not going to take those numbers. I'm going to hire outside companies to give me those numbers based on the shipping data and everything else, what they monitor out of satellites and everything else. OPEC is the only organization in the world that does that. So that's why when you go to the page of production, they show you two tables. One, what the governments are supplying, and one, what the companies are saying. And you can see the liars from this. But all others do not do the same. The last point on this is, if I am working for the IEA and I got all those German data and the German plans, and I have, let's say, 10 years experience, and I work this, I know a lot of things, and I'm looking at the German plan, I said, technically this does not work, economically this does not work, this is politically is not going to work, okay, and therefore what I'm going to take out of this is only 30% of what they give me. Well, I cannot do that, because they are a paying member of the organization, and I cannot do that. And they are paying my salary. So I have to take everything as is, although as an analyst, I don't agree with it. So what the outlook at the end is literally the wishes of politicians of the member countries. That's what it is. It's not an outlook. On the other side, don't think, and your audience should pay attention to this, don't think that others' forecasts are correct either. And the reason why, who are the others? You have consulting houses on one side, and you have the oil majors on the other. The oil majors' long-term outlooks are useless. Why they are useless? Because the oil majors come up with several scenarios, and they decide to invest based on a certain scenario. And that scenario will remain secret. That's really the top secret for the company. Why they have to share their secrets with other companies? So they keep that scenario secret, and then they look at the other scenarios and say, okay, which one I'm going to make public? Which one is good for my PR? So even if you go backwards and study the outlooks that have been provided by the oil majors versus where their investment went, you can see these are completely two different scenarios. So the scenario they are releasing to the public, this is just a PR scenario. And if you want to study it and present out of it and all that stuff, it's your problem. It's really worthless unless you want to cite the kind of the divergence between their behavior and what they are telling others. Some consulting houses, without naming names, but one of them, one of the largest in the world, they have clients all over. And therefore, they don't want to take a stand on something that annoys some of the clients. So their clients are diverse, and therefore they come up with kind of really weird things where, like, I used to have a friend who used to say the probability of I can tell you the price with a probability of 99.999999. The price will be between $10 and 110 between this time and this time. Just like they make it so wide and so big that any way you do it, they end up right, and therefore it's not that useful. It's the independence, and I'm not trying to market my work or people who are like me who are doing the work, but we are not influenced like this, and we don't have those influences to affect our outlooks, etc. So our outlooks are completely different from others, and we can literally defend every element of those outlooks without claiming what if and what if and what if.
That's a good breakdown. I think it's interesting to hear some of the different things that go into how these different groups look at some of the statistics. So I guess with all that said, what is your long-term outlook for oil, and what are you kind of expecting, I guess, over the next 3 to 5 years for maybe the oil price, some of the equities or different sectors, if you want to comment on that. But what are you kind of seeing as far as the long-term outlook?
Sure. We don't have enough time to go through the details, but those interested, they can go back to our spaces that are dedicated to these things, or to our Substack reports, etc., and read all the details, look at all the charts and everything else. The whole issue here is that we have BP predicting oil demand to peak next year. Of course, it's the same company that predicted 5 peaks before, and they failed. So this is their 6th attempt. And the biggest one was in 2019 when they said, in 2020 when they said oil has already peaked in 2019. And since 2019 until now, oil demand increased by 5 million barrels a day. 5 million barrels. And we have others who are predicting that we will have a peak this decade, and many of them basically think it's in like 2030, 2035. We have Chinese companies predicting a peak in Chinese oil demand in the next 5 years. We studied all of those, and they have too many holes. If you look at PP, for example, or you look at the IEA, remember they always, since we were young, they were warning us about the fine print. The media and analysts are not reading the fine print in those outlooks. The main assumption is this, that all the laws on the books will be implemented in full, and they will succeed 100%. So if they read,
unlikely.
all they got to do is just read the fine prints, basically, to realize, basically, they assume that everything will be applied and everything will succeed. And the last one, on time.
Seems unlikely.
Okay. We have thousands and thousands of books, articles, newspaper articles, speeches, investigations in the Congress, etc. All of it point to one thing: why this government policy failed, why this government policy failed, why government policy failures. We have books and books and books on this. And all of a sudden, when it comes to climate change, the assumption is a complete success. A complete success at a time when we have failure all over the world, when we have a retreat. I mean, every single day, we get a news item, at least one news item, showing a retreat from climate goals. The last one came from Google. So with all this retreat, why they are still assuming that everything being said is going to be implemented and is going to succeed? So that's number one. Number two, you tell them, okay, why you are predicting this peak? And they say, well, because of electric vehicles. Well, show me. And they show you the numbers. They tell you, for example, China sold 9.5 million EVs within China itself last year. If you assume that all of them replaced a gasoline car, in full, then that's only a replacement of 270,000 barrels a day. That's it, 270,000. So they take this 270 and say, look, we have a decline in demand, 270. Well, here's the problem. The first mistake is, tell me about the amount of oil, the additional amount of oil you use to make those electric vehicles. That's not included. Why? Because those electric vehicles are very heavy, because the batteries are very heavy. So manufacturers, especially in some countries, as you know, the taxation is on weight. So the manufacturers, to keep the weight down, they want to get rid of all the heavy metals and other things, and they want to use some composites. And those composites are made from petrochemicals, and mostly they are made from naphtha and LPG. So if you look at China's oil demand, you can see that as they made more EVs, their demand for naphtha and LPG went through the roof. Well, count that. Why you are not counting that? That's number one. Number two, they went for those climate policies without looking at the big picture. So they want to develop solar without looking at the big picture. They want to develop wind without looking at the big picture. They want to develop EVs without looking at the big picture. So we ended up with countries with, okay, I want to have a lot of EVs, but I don't have enough chargers. Okay? But the issue here is the idea that I wanted the EVs, but I'm still using the same tires that I use for gasoline cars. Remember, EVs are very heavy relative to the similar gasoline cars. And therefore, the tear and wear of tires is way higher. And on average, is 4 times higher, which means that between the time, if you have a gasoline car and a similar EV, between the time you change the tires on a gasoline car, you would have changed the tires on your EV 4 times. And those tires are made from what? Made from oil and gas. We calculated that between 2016 and 2022, this is worldwide, oil demand increased by about 60 million barrels just because of the additional tires needed. And that 60 million is not counted anywhere. Now, yes, it is a small amount relative to what we consume worldwide, etc., but still 60 million. Because if they want to count the 270,000 in China and others, then let's look at the 60 million then in this case. So there are a lot of things they are not doing. We also looked at a study, for those who are interested, it's on a Substack. We looked at Norway, which is the country with the highest percentage of EVs. And we found out that the ratio is not 1-to-1 when it comes to gasoline consumption. The ratio is 1 to 0.6, which is very important. What that means is, if you sell an electric vehicle, you're supposed to replace a gasoline vehicle that consumes, let's say, 10 barrels of oil or 10 barrels of gasoline a year. We found out that it is consuming, the consumption that's been saved is only 6 barrels, not 10. So it's not 1-to-1. And gasoline consumption basically did not decline proportionally. Diesel consumption went up. In some countries in Europe, gasoline consumption went up despite penetration of electric vehicles. So where is the problem? Well, there are 2 sides to the problem. The first one is, in Norway, for example, we found out that the electric vehicle was always the second car, because they kept their ICE vehicles for long distances. One of the ironies, and this is good to mention this here, that after Norway is a major oil and gas producer, they use the oil revenues to subsidize the electric vehicles. Okay? And they were very happy about it. They were bragging about it all the time. And those who support, or the pundits of electric vehicles, were bragging about the success of Norway. All of a sudden, we've seen Norwegian politicians begging people not to drive their electric vehicles. Why? Because a lot of people used to go to work and do all kinds of things using public transportation. And now they are driving electric vehicles and they cause massive congestion. So they start asking them, please leave your car at home and use public transportation. So when it comes to peak oil, of course, we can go on and on to explain why all those predictions of having a peak oil soon. Now, we might have a peak for gasoline. A peak of gasoline does not mean a peak in oil demand. We might have a peak in gasoline in some countries. It's not only possible, it's going to happen. But in terms of peak oil worldwide, peak oil demand, it's not going to happen for many reasons. And this is one of the, these are some of the reasons that I mentioned. For those who are interested in more detail, they can go to our Substack and check the details there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't think about that. Even if it doesn't end up in a gas tank somewhere, there's a ton of other uses for a lot of oil products and other stuff that is maybe not thought about as much. So I guess
let me tell you one more point that's very important for the audience to know. If every electric vehicle sold, they assume it replaces a gasoline or diesel vehicle. Here is the problem. Data shows that 15 to 20% of those who are buying electric vehicles, they are replacing their older electric vehicles, but they are still counting it as decline in oil demand.
Yeah, it's interesting because you see, I mean, just anecdotally, my parents are replacing one of their cars that happens to be electric with another electric. So it'll be interesting to see how many EVs actually end up on the road and how much it actually shifts. But what do you think investors in the energy space or energy equities, what do you think they should be on the lookout for over the next couple of years?
Energy demand is going through the roof, especially with AI and the movement toward autonomous vehicles. These technologies are extremely energy intensive and they use a lot of energy. That has tremendous implications for investors. People are shying away from investing in oil and gas simply because they see the trend and they think going toward electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles basically is going to destroy the demand for oil and gas. That's absolutely not correct. Here is why. Of course, and that includes coal too. Since we have a massive demand, massive increase in demand for energy, then whatever we are doing on the renewable energy front is barely enough. But those pundits of climate change policies, they wanted to replace oil and gas and coal using renewable energy. But with this massive increase in demand, they cannot. And therefore, the demand for oil, gas, and coal is going to remain there. And it's not going to shrink like they are talking about. And since they already scared investors, and we have lower investment that does not meet the future demand, we are heading for energy crisis. Of course, we can discuss the timing because the timing kind of very flexible in this case, depending on many issues. But the issue here is they already scared investors by making those claims, which is not good for everyone. If you are the International Energy Agency, you are in charge of energy security. And by scaring investors, you are not doing yourself a favor because you are going to go for a major crisis. So we still have a lot in oil and gas and coal to go for in terms of investment. I am very bullish on natural gas and LNG more than anything else because that's really where the future is. However, don't forget coal and don't forget oil, simply because we are not going to have a peak. And if we end up with a peak, it's a temporary peak. We have multiple peaks in this case. The issue that we have to pay attention to is this, that again, the data is bad, the reporting is bad, the politics is bad. So how to distill all of this and how to make a wise decision? Well, look at this. Because governments pushed the climate change policies on us, and they forced it on us. We ended up with a situation that we never had before, which is the degree of substitution among various energy sources increased substantially, which means that there could be some sleepy source there, and all of a sudden it will explode in your face. And if you are not aware of it to invest in it ahead of time, you are going to lose. So we've seen this. We got to remember the following, that they tell us that the weather is going to get worse because of climate change. Well, if you believe that, why you are investing in energy sources that are weather dependent? Solar, wind, and biofuel. If you really want to look for security and you think that the weather is going to get worse, you don't go for weather dependent investments. But if that's the case, and you are going to go for that investment, I am going to invest on the other side, the opposite to you, because when you fail, I'm going to win, and you are going to fail. And the data is there to see. The issue here is this, that when the weather becomes really hot, here in Texas, sometimes we get 110. And Texas had the largest wind capacity in North America, not only in North America, basically in the Americas, in North America and Latin America, or South America. The largest installed wind capacity. But when it is 110, why is 110? Because there is no wind. And if there is no wind, there is no wind power. So how we are going to cool Texas if you have no wind? And now you end up with problems with the gas sector because the gas sector cannot keep up, et cetera, et cetera. But those who have know the system, basically, they can really play it. And if we end up with a situation like this and we don't have enough gas to supply the LNG terminals, then we have a problem there. You look at countries like in Europe, when temperature is very high, wind does not blow, they resort to natural gas. And when they resort to natural gas, they have to import more LNG. They resort to the spot market, prices go up significantly. It becomes a big burden. They go back to coal. In Sweden, they go back to oil. In China, the same process. And when they end up with a heat wave, they end up with a high demand for natural gas. If there is not enough, or they cannot import more, or prices go up significantly, they turn to coal. And with coal, basically, the situation gets really worse. So the government mandate rotating brownouts or blackouts. And when they do the mandated blackout or brownouts, you have factories. In fact, last time, because of the drought, even Tesla factory stopped. But when they have brownout or blackouts for 2 months, and you have a factory and you have orders for the next 3 years, you cannot stop. So what you are going to do, you are going to resort to private generation. What is private generation? Next to your factory, you have those few generators that each generator is the size of a mid-sized room, and they use diesel. Well, in the whole country, you don't have the electricity that is based on diesel. All of a sudden, you have diesel. So you can see the degree of substitution increased substantially, and things just it just happened. Before, we were able to predict things. Now it's very hard to, because in case of India, for example, when LNG prices went up substantially, they stopped importing LNG. They resorted to Australian coal. Australian coal prices went up. They couldn't afford it. So they resorted to their own coal, which is the dirtiest coal on earth. And at the same time, the energy content in it is very low. Well, at the same time, they are going for climate change policies. So you can see what's happening here. The last one, the last example that kind of really sad. I mean, sometimes we say funny, but it's really sad. If you look at New England here, the United States is the largest oil producer on earth. And we produce basically literally the largest amount of light sweet crude. Yet, New England imports light sweet crude from other countries. We are the largest LNG exporter in the world. Yet, New England imports LNG from other countries. This is just an introduction to what I'm going to say. When they had a heat wave last year, they wanted to import LNG, but LNG prices were so high, they couldn't afford it. LNG just went through the roof last year. So what they did, they have some old oil fire plants that's been closed for a while. Oil share at certain hours went up from 0 to 40% of power generation in New England. Why this happened? For two reasons. First of all, we had a drought that lowered the hydro. Again, that's weather dependent. And wind stopped because it's too hot, weather dependent. Now they resorted to gas. Gas prices went through the roof because everyone wanted that LNG. They couldn't afford it. They went back to oil. Oil was at like almost $100 at that time, and yet they paid for it.
It's interesting because you can see some of the things and connect certain dots. Like I know they've been fighting over the Mountain Valley Pipeline from Appalachia up to New England, but obviously there's a bunch of legal and regulatory hurdles there. But like you're talking about, I'm a big fan of the coal sector and think that's going to be a pretty good place to be invested for the next 3 to 5 years. So I don't know if you have anything else you think my viewers should know about oil, energy in general, but I think we can start to wrap it up if you want to give any of your last thoughts here.
Well, just a warning, because this happens to me on a daily basis on Twitter. And the warning basically is the data is bad, but the reporting is as bad. And therefore, when you get the stories, especially the stories without legs, which mean that it does not have a main source with a clear name, with a clear position, etc., just be careful of those stories. And that's where we have the daily energy report basically, and that almost every single day we have to debunk some stories and say, look, this is your story, this is wrong, this information is wrong, this is the story. So, for example, one of the biggest stories we covered recently was Reuters and Bloomberg reported that Saudi oil exports declined substantially, which is about 800,000 barrels a day, because they were storing oil in preparation for the summer months because the demand for cooling increases and they need that oil. And therefore, their exports in June declined. And some others basically went farther and said, well, because of OPEC quota. Well, OPEC quota or OPEC plus quota are about production. They are not about exports. The Saudi production remained the same. It declined by about 75,000, which is a very small amount. Well, the true story basically has nothing to do with summer, has nothing to do with heating. We have the Hajj time. That's where the pilgrims come from all around the world in millions, and they go to the holy city of Mecca and Medina. And you have thousands of planes coming in and taking off. They need a lot of jet fuel. You have hundreds of thousands of buses and cars. You have hundreds of thousands of hotel rooms in every city that need the power to be on and the cooling to be on, etc. So they ignored all of those major events and they focus on what's coming in terms of summer heat. So the story was completely off. And there are too many stories like this, basically, where the media kind of just look at the veneer and they think they have a story, while the actual story is completely different.
Yeah, I think it's interesting.
Just like the petrodollar story, in a sense.
Yeah, you see it all the time. But the closing question I came up with for my guests is, what book do you think I should add to my reading list? Can be history, finance, investments, anything you think I'd find interesting.
This is not for everyone, unless for those people who are interested. I think, given what I said about the media and the change in the reporting, I think this book becomes very important for people who are interested to read.
For our audio listeners, he's holding up a copy of How to Win an Information War. So that'll definitely be one I'll add to the list. Yeah, I think that'll be definitely interesting when I get around to reading it. Before we hop off here, why don't you remind our viewers one last time where they can find you on Substack and on Twitter?
I am very active on Twitter. It's my first name, my last name, Anas Alhajji, Anas Alhajji. And if you go to the bio, you will find the links to the Substacks. We do have two Substacks, one for companies, one for individuals. And at the same time, we do have a Twitter subscription. We do have a space to discuss the outlook very soon, only for subscribers, for those who want to subscribe on X. And the rates basically are almost for everyone. So the pricing is reasonable if people want to check it. Although I have a website that I have not updated for a while. I do a lot of speaking engagements for those who are looking for a speaker for their events or to speak to their board members, etc. I do travel the world giving talks mostly about energy outlook, energy policy, oil market, LNG market, the natural gas market, energy in general. We do have our own outlook, energy outlook to 2050.
Yeah, that's a good breakdown. I appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Okay.
I think with that, we'll be wrapping up. So thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.